Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Dam Busters, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the fascinating, intricate and often contentious history of RAF Bomber Command. I'm James Jefferies, and together with my co-host Jane Gulliford-Lowes, we dive into the stories, strategies and individuals who played a pivotal role in one of the Royal Air Force's most essential units during the Second World War. One of the reasons we created this podcast was that we could share with our listeners many of the forgotten or lesser known stories of Bomber Command. It wasn't all bouncing bombs and Lancasters, and I hope you'll agree that we've managed that so far.
Now, most of our listeners will know that RAF Bomber Command was very much a multinational force and will be familiar with the Canadians, the Americans, the Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, Czechs, Poles, Dutch and Free French, who all served under the RAF Bomber Command umbrella. Today, in the final episode of this series, we're going to be exploring two little discussed but connected aspects. First, we're going to be talking about some of the hundreds of Norwegians who flew with the RAF during the war. Next, we're going to hear about the work of the Norwegian War Graves Service, who care not only for the Norwegian war graves abroad, but also for dozens of RAF Bomber Command aircrew killed in operations over Norway. I'm delighted to say that we're joined today by Haakon Vinje. Haakon serves as head of the Norwegian War Graves Service, which is part of the Ministry of Culture and Equality, a government department. He's been in post since 2019 and joined the ministry back in 2011. He also serves as honorary representative for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in Norway. Haakon holds an MSc in Comparative Politics from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome to the show, Haakon.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me.
Now, our listeners perhaps won't necessarily associate Norwegians with RAF Bomber Command, or indeed the RAF in general, perhaps maybe resistance fighters because of 633 Squadron. But can you give us a rough estimate, Haakon, about the sorts of numbers we're looking at and how these young men would have made their way to Britain after the Battle of Norway in April 1940?
Certainly. Norway was invaded by Germany on the 9th of April in 1940 and would remain occupied until VE Day in May of 1945. Leaving occupied Norway was punishable by death, so it was associated with great personal risk. Nevertheless, a number of Norwegians serving in the Norwegian armed forces or Norwegian civilians wanting to join the Norwegian forces would then escape occupied Norway, either by going out in fishing vessels across the North Sea, reaching the Orkneys, Shetland and other ports in the UK, or by travelling via Sweden, which was neutral during World War II, and then making their way onwards towards either the Middle East or the Soviet Union and through Canada to join the Norwegian forces there. As it happens, Canada was a very important place for the Norwegian Air Force during World War II, and there were a training camp there called Little Norway outside of Toronto. So Norwegian service members would then go on to either serve in separate Norwegian squadrons that were attached to the Royal Air Force, or they would be attached to the various other RAF commands, such as Bomber Command. And there were a total of 69 Norwegians serving in RAF Bomber Command, of whom 35 lost on operations. So the casualty rate for the Norwegians would then be slightly above 50%.
Haakon, can you explain a little about the work of the Norwegian War Graves Service? Now, many of our listeners will be familiar with the work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and I know you work very closely with them.
Certainly. So the Norwegian War Graves Service is a part of the Ministry of Culture and Equality, which is a government department in Norway. And our role is twofold. So we maintain and administer all foreign war graves in Norway from World War I and II. There are 29,500 foreign war graves in 143 different sites, ranging from the far north to the south of the country, with wildly different climatic conditions, with Arctic temperatures and conditions up north. So we also enforce rules and regulations. We fund the care of the war graves. We carry out inspections. We provide guidance and instructions to the local authorities. We implement renovation and restoration projects. We also carry out burials from time to time. The other part of our remit is to administer the Norwegian war graves abroad, the majority of which are in the UK and are cared for by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So we always had a very close and long-standing partnership with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who also maintain the majority of the Norwegian war graves abroad.
I wonder if you could provide us just with a little bit of background, a little bit more information about the invasion of Norway. I know we did an episode in the first series way back when, a long time ago now, which I was actually absent for, wasn't I?
Yeah.
So I just wonder if you could set the scene for listeners.
Certainly. So Norway was of strategic importance during World War II because of the long coastline which borders Russia and the then Soviet Union in the far north. What followed after the invasion in April was also a campaign in southern and northern Norway, where British, French and Polish forces came to the aid of the Norwegians. In June of 1940, the legitimate government and the royal family escaped to the UK and would then regroup and organize the onwards Norwegian resistance from the UK. So, since Norway was of strategic importance, the German occupying powers implemented several construction projects, building railroads, airports, ports, etc. And to do this, they used slave labor. So they imported Soviet and Yugoslavian prisoners of war, but then did slave labor and suffered in terrible conditions, particularly in the north of Norway. During World War II, there were 300,000 German soldiers stationed in Norway, which is a very large number compared to the Norwegian population at the time. A very large group of the foreign war graves that we maintain are then German war graves. So there are 11,500 of them, and there are 5 German war cemeteries. So, as mentioned, the Norwegian government regrouped in the UK and would then organize the resistance from there. At that time, Norway had the 4th largest merchant navy in the world, and the majority of these vessels would then go to Allied ports and become parts of the government-owned and government-operated Nortraship Shipping Company, which played a key role in the Allied war effort, of course, transporting munitions and food and other materials across the Atlantic and on. So, as for the Norwegian war graves abroad, you will find that more than half of them are merchant navy casualties who then died after having been torpedoed and other causes.
Do you want to mention the role of the Norwegian Air Force as well, Haakon?
Certainly. So a number of Royal Norwegian Air Force pilots made their way to the UK in the early days of spring 1940. Others would then later make their way to the Norwegian Air Force base in Canada, where all Norwegian airmen trained initially before going onwards for further training and for joining squadrons. At that time, there were 2 Norwegian air forces. There was an air arm of the Royal Norwegian Navy and an air corps in the Royal Norwegian Army. These were organized under a joint Air Force command, and then the Royal Norwegian Air Force as such would then be founded in 1944. So this is can be quite fascinating, because when you look at old pictures of Norwegian squadrons and Norwegian airmen from the war, you will see that they're wearing a mix of naval, army, Air Force uniforms, but they all serve together and yes.
I visited the museums at Akershus in Oslo a couple of years ago. That's the huge ancient fort complex right down the main harbour. For those of you who've been, you can't miss it. And I was staggered when I discovered the memorial to all the Norwegians who died while serving in the RAF during the war. I literally had no idea that so many had served, nor that so many had died. I think there's another large memorial in the entrance to the Air Force Museum at Gardermoen as well. It's just an entire wall of names, really. It's a fantastic museum. It's just near the airport at Gardermoen outside of Oslo. It's really, really well worth a visit. It's fantastic. But yet Norwegians served in literally every command. There were records of serving in Fighter Command, Bomber Command, Coastal Command, and Transport and Ferry Commands too.
I've wondered on that note, can you share with our listeners some of the stories of Norwegians who served with the RAF, perhaps beginning with Sub-Lieutenant Herman Hirsch, Becker, DFC?
That's one of the more poignant individual stories of Norwegian airmen. Hirsch Becker, DFC, grew up in Stavanger on the western coast of Norway. His parents were Jewish immigrants from St. Petersburg. Herman would then escape to the UK in 1941 on a fishing vessel with some of his friends, obviously at a great personal risk since escaping occupied Norway was punishable by death. And he then made his way to the Norwegian Air Force Base in Canada called Little Norway, which was in Toronto, and underwent initial training there. He later qualified as a navigator and was then sent to join one of the Norwegian squadrons operating out of Scotland on Catalina flying boats. He served there doing anti-submarine operations and scouting operations on the Norwegian coast. He later then requested a transfer to another squadron and was then able to join the Australian 464 Squadron, which operated Mosquitoes, and joined that squadron as a navigator. He then served a number of dangerous missions. And after having completed the first tour of duty, he went on leave. And it was at that time that he was informed that his family back home in occupied Norway had been deported and murdered in the Auschwitz concentration camp.
Gosh.
Goodness.
So Herman was then due to be rotated to RAF Transport Command, so then to serve for an operational tour there in a less exposed capacity compared to the Mosquito operations. But he was able to convince his commanding officers to let him rejoin the Australian 464 squadrons. So he went back to his old squadron, continued serving on Mosquitoes. He was then decorated with the Distinguished Flying Cross. And then during Operation Carthage on the 21st of March in 1945, served on one of the Mosquitoes that were bombing the Gestapo headquarters in what was then occupied Copenhagen in Denmark. It was a big operation, which tragically also resulted in some of the bombs hitting a children's school. Several children died following the successful bombing of the Gestapo headquarters. And it was on the way back from Copenhagen that Herman's Mosquito was hit by a flak and then forced to ditch in the sea. Herman was then seen exiting the aircraft through the top hatch, but he's then believed to have lost consciousness, probably due to a part of the tail fin hitting his head as the plane sunk. So Herman then lost consciousness and drowned, and his pilot went down with the aircraft. So Herman washed ashore on a Danish island called Samsø a few days later, and at that time he was buried as an unidentified airman. And it was not until 2000 when research by Danish representatives of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission were able to prove Herman's identity. This was then accepted by the Norwegian government, and his grave was rededicated with his name. And sometime later, the Star of David was also added to his headstone. So that's a very poignant individual story, and his memory lives on. The present day 24th class of the Royal Norwegian Air Force Academy has been named in Herman Becker's honor, so it's called the Becker class. A few days ago, on the 21st of March, the 80th commemoration of Operation Carthage took place in Copenhagen, and 2 cadets from the Becker class of the Norwegian Air Force Academy then participated in the ceremonies in Copenhagen.
Gosh, what a tragic story. That's so sad, isn't it? Now, Haakon, Norwegian aircrew were very much involved in D-Day as well, weren't they? Can you tell us the story of the crew of Lancaster ND 815, which was from RAF 97 Squadron, I believe?
Yes. So this is an example of a multinational bomber command cruise, and there are several multinational crews. this particular crew of Lancaster ND 815 was predominantly Norwegian. There were 5 Norwegians on board, including the pilot. There was a British flight engineer, the 18-year-old Gerald Ashpole from London, and a Canadian mid-upper gunner. And they were part of a Pathfinder force, so their mission was to mark the target area. And in the early hours of D-Day, June 6th, 1944, they were shot down following an attack on the Pointe-du-Hoc coastal batteries in Normandy. Very little is known about the circumstances of the crash, but 2 different German night fighter pilots claimed the kill. One of them would live until 2000 and would later put down his experiences in writing. And he is believed to have been the first German pilot to have seen the Allied invasion fleet forming off the coast of Normandy. So that's that. They were shot down. 2 of the crew, the Canadian mid-upper gunner and the Norwegian rear gunner, were later found with part of the wreckage, and they were buried in Bayeux War Cemetery. The Norwegian tail gunner, Sergeant Evensen, was identified in 1946 and then repatriated to Norway, so he's resting in Norway, here in Oslo. The Canadian mid-upper gunner, Flying Officer McCutcheon, is still resting in Bayeux. 2 other crew members were buried closer to the crash site in a small village called Osmanville in St. Clement's churchyard there. They were originally both unidentified, but the British flight engineer Sergeant Ashpole was identified by the Norwegian War Graves Service in 1950 when the grave was opened. And this was then accepted by the Royal Air Force, and his grave was rededicated and is resting there today. It was unfortunately not possible to identify the Norwegian that he was buried with. So he was repatriated to Norway and is resting as an unidentified airman, also in Oslo, not far from where the Norwegian tail gunner started resting. So there is no trace of the other crew members, and very little is known about what happened to the wreckage. In 2014, a memorial was erected to the crew at Osmanville, close to the churchyard where Sergeant Ashpole is buried. The Norwegian Armed Forces held a commemorative ceremony there on the D-Day anniversary last year in 2024, with the participation of the Norwegian Chief of Defense and also the Chief of the Norwegian Air Force. And the Command Master Sergeant of the Royal Norwegian Air Force, he then laid a wreath on the grave of Sergeant Ashpole, the British flight engineer who is still resting there.
Now, there's one story, Haakon, that I in particular have been really looking forward to hearing about, and that's the incredible story of Nordal Grieg. Can you share Nordal's story with us?
I'd love to. This is a special story, and Nordal Grieg is a very well-known figure in Norway, or a legendary figure even. He was a poet, a journalist, and a playwright. He was a former communist who would later become a close friend of the Norwegian royal family, and he would later become a war correspondent. So he had quite the biography. He worked as a sailor before the war and also as a poet, then went on to live for 2 years in the Soviet Union. He also went to cover the Spanish Civil War as a war correspondent, before then going to the north of Norway and participating in the defense of Norway after the German invasion in 1940. He then later participated in the evacuation of the gold reserves from the Bank of Norway to the UK. Once in the UK, he joined the Royal Norwegian Army and became a war correspondent, later rising to the rank of captain. And he would be embedded in various Norwegian units in the UK and elsewhere. And he would also join them on operations in the Arctic. He would join Norwegian Catalina crews on their operations. Nordal Grieg lost his life over Berlin on the 2nd of December in 1943 as a supernumerary on Lancaster LM 316. which was part of the Royal Australian Air Force 464 squadron. They were shot down following a bombing raid on Berlin and crashed in Kleinmachnow in Berlin. And it is known that Nordal Grieg and the rest of the crew were originally identified after the crash and buried in named and marked graves. But Nordal Grieg has no known grave today, so the question of his grave remains a mystery, and it's been researched by the Norwegian government at various intervals over the last 80 years. The original cemetery where Grieg and his crew and the other crew members were buried ended up being in East Berlin after the war, and this necessitated moving the graves there, the Allied burials, to West Berlin, to the new Commonwealth War Cemetery there. And this seems to have been a somewhat hurried process. There's believed to have been some difficulty in interpreting the original German cemetery plans and maps, and it is understood that this led to the identities of several casualties being lost in the process. And there are several hundreds of unidentified airmen resting in the Berlin War Cemetery. And as I understand it, a considerable number of them might have been unidentified at one point in time. So it is believed that Nordal Grieg is one of these unidentified airmen resting in Berlin. And it is hoped that future research or new archival discoveries might lead to his grave being found one day. Resting there without a grave is a fate that he shares with 3 of the other members of the same crew. They're also probably resting as unidentified airmen in the same cemetery. And Nordal Grieg is, as I mentioned, a legendary figure in Norway. He's considered as almost as a national bard. And his poetry is turned to in times of grief and national crisis, such as the terrorist attacks on the 22nd of July in 2011 in Norway. Memorial has been erected to the crew at the crash site in Kleinmachnow in Berlin, and a part of the wing of Lancaster LM-316 was retrieved from the lake there and is exhibited in the Norwegian embassy in Berlin.
Gosh, what a story. That's just incredible. What a life that he led. It's just so many different aspects, and yeah, it's absolutely incredible story. I would certainly like to learn more about him. I was wondering if there's any sort of accounts of his life written in English. I'll have to try and do a bit of research on that, I think. So now we're going to turn to some of the war graves of RAF Bomber Command crewmen that can be found in Norway. Now, I've been lucky enough to visit the war cemeteries in both Narvik and Trondheim, and both are immaculately kept, as you would expect. There's quite a lot of RAF personnel buried in the Stavner Cemetery in Trondheim in particular, and several of those were lost in the early raids on the Tirpitz, including some 10 Squadron men. As regular listeners will know, I've done an awful lot of research on 10 Squadron and feel like I know many of these young men. There were a number of raids on the Tirpitz in the early part of 1942, many of them involving Halifaxes. I'm just going to share with you an extract from the 10 Squadron history from Brooklands to Rise, which was written by Dick King and Ian Macmillan. I know Ian very well. So the account is as follows. An operation against Tirpitz was flown on the night of 30th of March by a force of 34 Halifaxes. 76 Squadron provided the first wave, with 10 Squadron providing a second wave, together with 12 aircraft from 35 Squadron. On this occasion, each was carrying a load of 4 modified 1,000-pound naval mines, but in the event, cloud covered the ship and no attacks were possible, and most of the mines were jettisoned. 6 aircraft were lost that night, 2 of them from 10 Squadron, the crews of Squadron Leader Webster and Pilot Officer Blunden of the Royal New Zealand Air Force. Both were thought to have been shot down by anti-aircraft fire in the Hemnefjord area west of Trondheim. 3 bodies from Pilot Officer Blunden's crew, those of Pilot Officer Day, Second Pilot Sergeant Richards, the flight engineer, and Sergeant May, the wireless operator air gunner, were recovered from the water and subsequently were buried in the churchyard at Hyne. On the 4th of April, Squadron Leader Webster's body was also found at the Terningen Lighthouse, 55 miles west of Trondheim. All 4 were eventually laid to rest at Stavne in Trondheim, and I actually went to visit them and to pay my respects when I was there last February. I do have some photographs of the cemetery and of the graves, which I will add to our social media so that you can see those. And of course, the raids on the Tirpitz continued. I think we should definitely do an episode on the Tirpitz raids, James. There's just so much to talk about.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I think it will be a really good one. And just a month later, after the events that I've just been describing, 10 Squadron's Don Bennett was shot down on the night of 20th of April 1942. Bennett and a couple of his crewmates famously avoided capture and escaped into Sweden. Bennett went on to found a Pathfinder force, and his aircraft S Sugar was eventually retrieved from her fjord grave. That's the Halifax you can see now at the RAF Museum in London. She is not being restored, and she has a ghostly, almost ethereal quality to her, which I think is very striking and lives long in the memory.
Yeah.
You're very familiar with that aircraft as well, aren't you, James?
I am, yeah. And I remember as a kid going to see it, and it was the first Halifax I saw. It was before I saw Friday the 13th. And I remember thinking, I want them to restore it and, make it look like the Lancaster. But actually, since I've grown up, I've gone, I like it as that memorial. It's a massive reminder, really, of what happened to so many Lancasters and such like. And yeah, very familiar with it, yeah.
Now, if you want a visualization of a bomber attack on Trondheim, I think it's episode 2 or 3 of Masters of the Air. The crews take part in a daylight raid on the U-boat base. It's quite sort of realistic, I think, particularly with regard to the layout of the landscape in and around Trondheim. There's no spoilers. They were unsuccessful, and I can confirm that the U-boat pens are very much still there. I'll put some photos up of those too, but it gives you a good idea of the sort of topography of the area.
Definitely. Well, sadly, that is all we have time for. Thank you, Haakon, for being a fabulous guest, especially to wrap up what is the end of Series 2. Can you believe it, Jane? What is it, 43 episodes now? Gosh.
No idea. I've lost count. It's been a lot of episodes, yeah.
It has. But yeah, I think we deserve a little bit of a break, which is what we're going to be having now. What will you be up to in that time, Jane?
Well, by coincidence, I will be going to Norway twice during that time, I hope. Yeah. So, yeah, my little house is just sitting there waiting for me to go and visit. So I'm really looking forward to that. We're going over on the 12th, I think. So, yeah, really, really looking forward to getting set up there. And, yeah, I'm just absolutely exhausted, to be honest. It's been a really busy few weeks with the book coming out and with finalising the house purchase and with work in the real world as well. That's been really busy too. So yeah, I am absolutely ready for a rest now. I really, really am. What about you?
Yeah, me too. So the main thing is working on this chapter, the next chapter from PhD, which is about heroism in the air, as well as the book. I'm working on a conference paper as well, and I'm reaching the last stages of lecturing on the current module at Essex before prepping for the World War II course at Cambridge. And so quite a lot. I'll also finish my Airfix Bristol Blenheim and maybe start the Wellington that I got for my birthday, which was
priorities.
Birthday present. Absolutely, yeah. I'll do that before all the rest of it, yeah. Everything will have to wait until I finish the Blenheim. So yeah, as we said, we are going to be off the air for a little bit, but we are going to be doing a live stream Q&A for our subscribers, probably in mid-May, and we'll be emailing you all about that. So there's another great reason to become a paid subscriber, to be a part of this. You could do this by clicking on the link in the show notes. And well, once again, as ever, a massive thank you for our existing subscribers. And honestly, without you, there would be no podcast. So thank you so much.
Yeah, once again, thank you all so much for your support and for listening to Never Mind the Dam Busters. We've had some fantastic guests and really memorable episodes in this series, I think. And I personally still haven't got over the episode we recorded with Andrew Panton about Just Jane, the Lancaster, and his uncle Christopher's story. That had me in absolute bits. Yeah. And so many of our listeners have been in contact to sort of describe the impact that it had on them too. But yeah, they've all been great episodes and we've had some really, really great guests. It takes a huge amount of work to put the show together on top of our day jobs, our writing and public speaking commitments, and we are very, very much in need of a break. So we'll be back early summer with Series 3 and we have more superb guests lined up for you on a wide variety of subjects. But if you've got any topics that you'd like us to cover, If you've got any guest suggestions, or indeed if you would like to volunteer to be a guest yourself, please do get in touch. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a review or star rating on your favourite podcast platform. Tell all your friends, tell your mum, tell your auntie, tell everybody, and share our links on your social media. A special thank you to Haakon Vinje, our guest today, and we'll see you all again in the summer. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.